Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another how-to video. I'm recording this on October 2nd, 2015. In this chapter, we're introducing test-driven development, and at the end of the last episode, we had just learned how to manipulate the DOM from JavaScript, how to programmatically manipulate the DOM. And the DOM, once again, is the API, the interface, the way you can find out about the browser's internal representation of a web page, as well as other things. You can actually look at CSS as well. And to remind you, we had looked at three important things: how to create an element, how to modify it and modify the DOM, and how to remove an element from the DOM. And in the episode before that, we looked at red-green refactor, our test-driven development cycle, which is think, red, green, refactor, and then repeat. Now in this episode, we're going to bring these two concepts together to test drive our very first piece of front-end code. Now, as a reminder, what we have here is we have our sample application. This is going to be a tab switching application. We're demonstrating the ability to make a content appear and disappear when you click on tabs. This isn't working yet because we haven't got any JavaScript in here yet. We need to test drive that. We need to program it, and we're going to use test-driven development to do it. So the question I have for you is, how do we get started? What is one small thing we can do to get this started? Well, I don't know, but I do know that the first thing we're going to do is take out this sample code. So let me go ahead and get rid of this. Let's see, I'll keep around a little bit of it just as an example. So we've got our create, our modify, our append, and our remove. That might come in handy. We'll want to remember that, I'm sure. And we are describing tabs, so that's good. And what are we describing about tabs? I don't know yet. Okay, enough futzing. Let's look at this. What I just did, I call that moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, just fiddling around with stuff that's not really important. And although the name of it, moving deck chairs on the Titanic, makes it sound like an utterly useless activity, I actually find that when I'm thinking or I'm having trouble thinking of something, just doing unrelated cleanup will help my brain get started. I think my brain is directly attached to my fingertips, to be honest. So for me, this is something that's useful, is to just do little pieces of cleanup that aren't really related to the problem I'm solving. Sometimes that will shake loose whatever it is I need to know. Maybe that will work for you. Maybe it won't. Anyway, we've moved as many deck chairs as we can. So let's take another look at this. Well, we know what we want to do, right? We want these to cause the tabs to switch. But that's too much code. We're only allowed a max of 5 lines of production code, and that is probably more than 5 lines of production code. Even if you can think of how to do it in less than 5 lines of code, it's going to be more than one test, I think, and we need to think of just our first test. So what can we do? How do we want this to behave differently than it is now? Well, one thing that comes to mind is that we are going to have it switch back and forth when we click the tabs. But even before it does that, when it comes up, we only want it to display the tab that's active, right? So what that means is that one of these tabs needs to be marked as active, and all the content needs to disappear except for that first tab. So there's an idea. Let's bring up our to-do. We need to mark a tab as active, and we need to hide all inactive content divs. Remember, the way this is implemented is with an unordered list for the tabs and divs for the content. So this is starting to get more reasonable. I can imagine marking a tab as active is something we could do, but still there's a question of what tab and what is a tab and how does our code know what a tab is? It's still kind of big. Hiding all the inactive content divs, also not too bad, but still, how does it know which ones are inactive? Let's take this and make it even smaller. Often when there's something to be done that involves multiple things, I'll start out by doing just one thing. So we could say hide one inactive content div. And we can make that, and that's still a little bit big. You can see now why I say that the think step is the most important and the hardest. This is still a little bit big, but what if we just hid one content div and didn't even worry about whether it was active or not. Just hiding one content div, that will make progress for us, right? I think it will. Let's try that. Hide one content div. That's our test. Before I do that though, I just realized this addition test is poorly named. Let's call it tabs test. There we go. And let's make sure that refactoring didn't break anything. And it didn't. By the way, you should only ever refactor when you have a green bar, when all your tests are passing. If you refactor when you have a red bar and your refactoring breaks something, there's a good chance you won't notice. Or even if you do notice, it'll be harder to figure out what went wrong versus what else is wrong in your code. Okay, so now we've got the right test name. Now we want to write a test, which is that tabs hides an element. Let's just say it hides an element. What we're doing here, that we're in the red, so we did the think part, we broke down the problem into something really small, and now what we're doing is the red bar. We want to write a test that will fail. And this is a exercise in API design. The red bar portion of the red-green refactor cycle, that's your design portion. That's when you get to decide how your production code is going to work, because you're going to call it. So I just realized there's an even smaller step we can take here. Before we do hides an element, we can just have has an API. Because right now there's nothing to call, right? There's no file at all. So let's do that. Let's write has an API. What is that API going to look like? Well, we're going to require something, right? Let's call it tabs. Let's require tabs.js. And then let's call, well, and in fact, that right there will fail, won't it? Because tabs.js doesn't exist. There's our first red bar. The first very, very small thing that we can do that will cause our test to fail, requiring the library. So if I run Jake, that fails, and it should fail with tabs does not exist, and it does. Could not find module tabs. Perfect. Now let's get it to pass. This should be really easy. All we have to do is create the file, tabs.js. Doesn't even need to do anything else. And that should now be a green bar. Really small steps. Okay, good. We've got that. Next, we want it to have an API, right? Let's go back to our test. It has an API. What is that API going to look like? Tabs dot, remember this is a red bar, design activity. How do we want our tab to run? Well, what I'm thinking is that what we'll do is when we start up our page, we'll run this tab library and we'll give it a list of our tabs and the content and tell it to manage it. And then from there, the clicking and stuff will all be handled for us automatically and our code won't have to do anything. So I think what we're going to do then is initialize it. Yeah, let's call tabs.initialize. That should be enough to make our test pass. That's red bar. So we'll run our test. We should get a failure that the initialize function doesn't exist, and we do. Remember, if you predict the result of each test as you go, when something is different than your prediction, that means you're no longer in control of your code and you stop and you figure out what went wrong. So now we've finished our red bar. We have a failing test. Now it's time for green bar. Make this test pass. We need an initialization function. The way we do that is we say exports.initialize equals function. And let's give that function a name for ease of debugging. Function initialize. That should be enough to make this pass. And it does. Excellent. Next step, refactor. Well, this code is so simple, there's really no way to improve it, except maybe take out this line of code. But honestly, that's ridiculous and anal. So never mind. What about here? Really not a lot we can do here either. We've got some comments here that I'd normally delete, but we're saving that for later. Yeah, this is good. We are good. I'm going to go ahead and check this in though. We've created our tab library and it doesn't do anything yet. Okay. In a way, we've been moving deck chairs on the Titanic again. We've been doing trivial things as a way of helping us get started. Let's look at our to-dos. We have an API. Right, we want to hide one content div. We're back around, we're back around to the think step. Hide one content div. Is that still what we want to do here? I think it is. So let's change this existing test. This test doesn't add a lot of value. And if we change it, we'll still be calling initialize. So it's not like we're losing anything. So let's say that tabs hides a div or hides an element. Because really it doesn't matter if it's a div or not. And how is that going to work? Well, we're going to pass the element into initialize, and then we're going to expect tabs.initialize to hide it, right? Yes. Okay, so now we know what we're going to do. We finished our think step. Now time to get a red bar. This is going to be a bit challenging. This is where we are going to really have to bring in our knowledge about the DOM. Because in order for this to work, we have to have an element to pass into tabs.initialize. So we're going to want to, remember, how does it work? Arrange, act, assert. So we need to create the element. We need to arrange our test, and we'll create the element in a visible state. And then we'll run our initialize function, and then we'll assert that it's no longer visible. So here, create the element. Here, assert that it's no longer visible. Okay. You think we can do that in less than 5 lines of code? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes you end up writing a little bit more test code, especially when getting into new stuff. But I try to avoid it. So how do we create the element? Well, we can just use this code right here. Create an element, create a div, and let's call this element rather than div, because this code acts as documentation, and our test name says hides an element. So this is clearly the element we're hiding. So we create it, we pass it to our initialize function, then we assert that the element is no longer visible. How can we do that? We need a way of knowing if the element is visible. There's 2 ways to make an element invisible. One is to simply remove it from the DOM, have it disappear entirely out of the DOM. However, that's kind of like taking a sledgehammer to a flea. It's not the best approach. If we were writing this without JavaScript and we wanted one of these contents to exist but not to be visible, how would we make it disappear then? Well, if you know CSS, you know that there's a display property that you can set to none that will make things invisible. So if we set this element's display property to none, then the element will disappear. So again, see how we're designing the behavior of our application when we're in the red bar step? It's funny, the think and the red bar steps are the important ones, the ones where you do all the work. The actual green bar to implement the code is not very big. And then again, refactor it tends to be some real thinking. Green bar is supposed to be easy. And the reason for that is because we want to make it easy to have working code. It's just kind of a neat feature of test-driven development is that it's easy to have working code. All the thinking happens in all the other parts. Of course, by saying that, what I'm really doing is avoiding the question, how do we check if this element is visible or not? Well, what we can do is we can ask the browser what styles are on the element. There's a method called getComputedStyle that we can call. And then once we know the styles that are on the element, we can ask for the state of the display style. We can say, styles, tell me the value of the display property. And once we've done that, we can assert that the display property is equal to none. Because the element will have disappeared when display is equal to none. That should give us a red bar that says expected none, or it says that the element will be, I don't know, visible or whatever the default is, block perhaps. We expected none, but it's going to actually be block. Let's go ahead and run it. Red bar, we should get a red bar now. Oh, look at that. We're getting block where we are expecting none. Perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. So to make this pass, in our initialize function, we take an element and we need to make it disappear. How do we do that? Well, if you've been poking around MDN, you might have discovered, remember, Mozilla Developer Network, a great source of API documentation for JavaScript in the DOM. Then you might have found out that elements have a style property that we can change. If we set style to none, then that should cause the element to disappear. I wonder if that will work. Let's give it a try. Ooh, it did not work. Or rather, on mobile Safari we got ... On IE11 it worked, on IE9 it worked, on Safari 9 we got ... on Chrome Mobile we got ... and on Firefox it worked. So we've got a cross-browser issue. Now the question is this a problem with what we're coding here? Or is it a problem with what we have written here in our test? That is a very good question. And that is what we'll cover in our next episode when we look at debugging our tests. Just a reminder of what we've done so far is we've gone through the red-green refactor cycle with our DOM. First, we did the think step where we thought about what code we wanted to write. And in this case, we decided that the small thing that we could do is having our tab code hide an element. Then we wrote that test, that's the red bar. We saw it fail. Then we wrote the production code to make it pass. And we saw it pass, but not on every browser. Once we get it to pass, we'll refactor. Now there's one more thing here that we haven't done yet that I'm not going to do until we get this test to pass, but I just want to make a note of it. And that is that when we are working in the DOM, there's a third part of our tests. I call it the YAR pirate pattern. Arrange, act, assert, reset. We need to remove the test element. That way, at the end of every test, we're back to a pristine state. It's a really important aspect of writing your tests, is each test needs to stand alone and put everything back the way it was when it started. So reset is not found in every test, but will be found in most of your DOM-related code because you're often going to be creating elements and adding them. All right, your exercise for this time is to reproduce what we've done so far, taking really small steps to go through the red-green refactor cycle several times. Use it to create the tabs file, use it to create the API, the initialize API, and then test this first thing of hiding an element. For those of you who want a challenge, see if you can figure this out yourself. There's a little clue at the end about what might have gone wrong. It's a bit subtle though. Good luck, and I will catch you next time.